President Biden has slipped to his lowest approval rating since taking office. That is according to new CNN polling, which shows Joe Biden with the approval of just 37% of Americans. Much of this appears to hinge on economic concerns, but we're also seeing a drop in support among some Democrats due to Joe Biden's stance on the Israel-Hamas war. An NBC News poll from last month found that more than half of registered voters disapprove of Biden's handling of the war. Support also appears to be wavering among Arab and Muslim voters, whose votes could be crucial in 2024, particularly in swing states. A November survey of Michigan Democrats by Lake Research Partners found that in 2024, Trump-Biden's matchup, 74% of Arab and Muslim Americans in the state would likely consider voting for a third-party candidate instead. The polling group, which did extensive work for Biden's 2020 campaign, was commissioned to carry out this survey by a progressive advocacy group. Joining me now is Shadi Hamid, columnist and editorial board member at The Washington Post. He is the author of The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. Shadi, it's great to see you. I have to say I was drawn to this piece that you wrote, but also to what you posted on social media. And I kind of wanted to start with this poll among Michigan Democrats, its findings about Arab and Muslim American voters and their sentiment. Do you think the Biden campaign's team realizes how much these votes matter and how much they're in trouble with them?
I think that the Biden team realizes it. I don't know if they care enough to do something about it. I think they should. I think they should be alarmed. If we look at some of these battleground states like Michigan, but also Arizona, which Biden won by around 10,000 votes in 2020, there's about 60,000 Arab Americans in Arizona. So if you have very slim margins in the upcoming election against Trump, you know, a few thousand votes here and there can actually make a significant difference. And it's not just Arab and Muslim Americans that are the issue here. Arab Americans also, like, they talk to other people, they have friends, colleagues, and so forth. And they also are reflective, I think, of where the progressive base is, a little bit more on Israel, Palestine. And in that NBC News poll, about 70% of young voters disapprove of Biden's handling of the Gaza war. That's a pretty large percentage. And some of this will depend on turnout in 2024. And already young voters aren't thrilled about Biden. I mean, he is pretty old and a whole number of other things. And you add one more factor on top of that, and that could prevent people from actually going to the polls. They could say, well, you know, we're afraid of Trump, but we don't feel strongly enough for Biden to actually go out and cast our ballot for him.
And that's the point I wanted to ask you about, the so-called alternative. And you wrote about this in your opinion piece for The Washington Post, looking at why Arab Americans don't want to vote for Biden in 2024. And you write, quote, "I suspect that patronizing arguments asking Arab Americans to suck it up and vote Biden regardless of his actual policies are unlikely to be effective. Their votes must be fought for." What do you say, or what are you hearing based on this conversation you've had with folks about the argument that the other guy is so much worse and it could end our democracy? So just suck it up and vote for Joe Biden to preserve what we have now.
Yeah, so whenever I share my conversations with Arab Americans and how there's this concern around Biden, people will just be very dismissive on social media and in conversations, and they'll be like, Shadi, Trump is so much worse. What are you guys thinking? Why are Arab Americans being irrational? Why can't they just suck it up? And I think this misunderstands how people think about voting. You have to be able to make an affirmative case for your candidate. You can't always rely on the threat that if Trump wins, it's going to be so much worse, because Trump right now is still a hypothetical. It's Biden who people are focusing on right now. He's the one who's actually overseeing and handling America's relationship with Israel and the war in Gaza and so on. And, you know, one thing I mentioned in that Washington Post column is, let's imagine another issue. Let's say Biden woke up tomorrow and said he doesn't think Americans should have the right to an abortion. I can imagine there would be many liberals across the country who would say, that's a bridge too far. Sorry. We get that Trump is worse on abortion, but we're not going to be able to vote for Biden if he doesn't share our sentiments on this core issue. each of us as voters has a threshold of conscience where we're just not going to feel comfortable voting for someone who we think has diverged so much from where we are.
Look, we're a year out from the election. Anything can happen. But as you mentioned, and we're having the same conversations within our communities, I know it's anecdotal, but what have you heard from people you've spoken to about what it might take to get Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in key swing states, perhaps like Georgia, which you won by 12,000? You mentioned Arizona, Michigan. What, if anything, can the Biden administration do to try and mobilize or energize these voters back into their coalition?
Yeah, well, Amy, you're exactly right. There is still a long ways to go. I think that a lot of this will depend on how long Israel's military operations in Gaza continue and ground offensive. It could take a long time. There's no sign that this is ending anytime soon. So the longer this goes on, the bigger a problem the Biden administration has. If the Biden folks actually end up putting more pressure on Israel going forward, and we have seen some signs of this with Secretary of State Tony Blinken really urging Israel and being quite public about it, saying Israel has to think about protecting civilians. It has to prioritize that. So I think the more we see rhetoric like that, and it can't just be rhetoric, it has to be backed up by policy. Because if Israel doesn't actually see consequences, then it has no reason to be more precise in its military operations. It has no real incentive to think seriously about the day after in Gaza. So I think on those fundamental issues going forward, the Biden administration has a real chance to improve and to be more even-handed. That doesn't mean they have to be anti-Israel. No, I have very few people are calling for that. It's just about being more balanced and more concerned with Palestinian lives. And I think for Arab Americans, there is this sense in our communities that Biden just doesn't feel it. When it comes to the Palestinian civilian toll, it's just numbers, it's collateral damage. And I think if Biden is able to muster more feeling and more sympathy and actually reflect that in a clear way, that can begin to make a difference.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, I look at the ceasefire vote yesterday, the veto, and I don't think that certainly helps the Biden case among potential Arab American Muslim voters. That's policy versus the rhetoric that you're talking about. Let me ask you from the flip side, if you've come across through your reporting or conversations a will on the Arab American or Muslim community to be better organized politically, to be involved in lobbying efforts, to try and launch initiatives that make there be a political consequence for politicians who take these positions that are anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim?
Yeah, so I think it's a big difference now compared to post 9/11. I think we've had a younger generation that is more vocal, that is more present in media, in the public conversation. And I think that makes it harder to ignore Arab Americans. And I think there's also a confidence when it comes to organizing in battleground states. You have native-born Arab Americans who actually know how American politics works, and they're willing to kind of bring their influence to bear. So I think you are seeing that kind of mobilization, and it is making a difference. There is also this effort in battleground states to hashtag abandon Biden and to kind of bring different organizations together. I mean, we'll see how effective that is, but it's clearly making waves. The fact that we're talking about it now means that it is filtering up. And I think, I'm hearing this nonstop from Arab and Muslim American friends. This keeps on coming up. So I think something really has changed, and this could be a hinge moment for the Arab American community.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how they organize, how they politically mobilize, and whether or not they are going to make a difference. Shadi Hamid, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate all of your writing.